Sometimes it's important to try to infer the intentions of the founders, and I often think about the intentions of the authors of our literature on the core curriculum. I think it's an interesting subject because it's a question probably hanging in the air for many of us, why it is we need to give, especially if we're literature teachers, equal time to fiction and nonfiction. And I think one way to rationalize whatever you may think about the legitimacy of the idea, I think one way to rationalize it is to suppose that the authors hoped that humanities teaching would be more seamless than perhaps it has been in the past. In other words, that English wouldn't be a sequestered subject, and that it would flow naturally into social studies, history, and the other subjects that one teaches. And it's an interesting idea, and it moves me to propose a couple of seminars in which literature is taken up as a phenomenon of public life. Now, my poetry courses have always had as one of their primary purposes the desire to cure teachers of poetry anxiety. In other words, there are sort of many good literature teachers always come to you confessing that they really do have a blind spot about poetry. Well, good. We're here to do something about that blind spot for those who perhaps wish to overcome it. And so even the topic of one of my two proposals, which is poetry and public life, even though there really will be, for me, a somewhat unusual emphasis on public life, nevertheless will remain poetry specific. We will be talking about the ways in which the themes that we take up are mediated by the medium, and the ways in which poetic form really does have a shaping and a directive power over subject matters of any kind. But it really is, it is a topic that is, in a certain sense, for many people, including me, a little bit against the grain, because we think, especially those of us whose inner poetry critic has to do particularly with lyric poetry, we think of poetry as personal, private, inward. And we have to remind ourselves that poetry is often written in the service of public themes, ideas, aims, and aspirations, and very plainly in some cases, and perhaps less so in others, and the ones in the cases that are less so are perhaps among the more interesting. Toward the end of that seminar, I would hope to have something to say about poems that don't seem to have anything to do with public life at all. I think of Wordsworth's sonnet composed on Westminster Bridge, or Keats's three-strophe ode called To Autumn. Seems to be exclusively about the landscape that surrounds him, and again of a variety of Emily Dickinson poems. I heard a fly buzz, poems of that kind, and I'd like to take up poems of that sort in order to lay bare within the poems the actual social world and social circumstances that give rise to the poem. That's something that we would do toward the end of the seminar, however, and in the meantime, we'd take up the themes, the public themes that poetry has so often consciously addressed and devoted itself to. The theme of war, the First World War poems of Wilfred Owen, the extraordinarily interesting poem related to the Second World War by Randall Jarrell called Eighth Air Force. Poems having to do with revolution and reform. I will be tempted not to go beyond the great poetry of the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley on this subject. England in 1819, Ode to the West Wind, poems of that kind. Poems having to do with sexual politics and identity. The great volume of poetry by Adrienne Rich, diving into the wreck seems to me to be a good place to start. We would probably have something to think about from that. And then also a category that's often overlooked because it can be pretty easily derided, the poetry of public praise, sometimes in the context of the duties of a poet laureate. That we will look at some laureate poems, one by Alfred Lord Tennyson, perhaps, but we'll also think about, for example, poems written for presidential inaugurations by Robert Frost, by Maya Angelou, and think about the difficulties and triumphs of poetry writing of that kind. So as you can see, a great variety of potential topics which we would certainly hope to decide among when we met together during the course of the summer. Now, my other proposal has to do with what many of you know to be my quite amateurish first love, which is teaching Shakespeare. I'm something of an expert in the first field, perhaps not so much teaching Shakespeare, but it is a passion of mine to do so, even though I'm only gradually approaching probably the qualification to do so. This time, I'd like to talk about Shakespeare and society. In the past, I have led seminars on Shakespeare and identity, on Shakespeare and what Harold Bloom calls human character, which we took up just partly as a question of character, for which read personality, partly as a question of character as it's understood in the tradition of thinking about theater as something that we think about in relation to plot and thought and diction and other things. And in any case, those went rather well, I thought, and it was always possible to assign 6 plays that one particularly liked. And I want to do that again this time, but I want to take up topics in the first 3 instances that are expressly political topics, and also have, for reasons perhaps too obvious to dwell on, a bearing on our lives today. The first having to do with forms of government. Macbeth was performed shortly after the accession to the English throne of James I, who had been, as you probably know, James VI of Scotland. And his coming to the throne was a kind of celebration for those who were interested in the problem of a triumph of centralized government. So Shakespeare chooses for his theme in Macbeth the drawbacks of decentralized government. Feudalism is what brings about the murky world in which Macbeth comes to prominence. Malcolm, on the other hand, who is Shakespeare's stand-in for James I, is a figure of extraordinary virtue, caring only about the good of the state, whose ultimate triumph at the end of Macbeth, projected forward, is the centralization of government, obviously involving the relative loss of Scotland's independence in England. And so there's a very good literature on this subject, and I think it's fascinating to study Macbeth from this point of view, as a play that's written with the idea of weighing the relative advantages and disadvantages of forms of government. Second play would have to do with, and of course we can scarcely think of a reason why this would be relevant, populism, charismatic leadership, and the state. This play is Coriolanus, and the figure of Coriolanus, full of resentment against the patrician order, amassing at his back the enthusiastic support of the masses of people, of a massive popular movement, whose rise to power, he had power already, but of a somewhat different nature. I'm trying not to be allegorical, whose rise to power was a matter of fascination and horror for the surrounding world, and of course the play. In the play, we do get to witness his comeuppance, and so there would be an element of satisfaction, perhaps, in reading Coriolanus. I hope not such a visceral satisfaction by next summer, but in any case, obviously it's a topic which we may still residually feel the resonance of. Then maybe what we would now call impeachment. I'd like to study Richard II as a meditation on the grounds whereby a government can legitimately be overthrown. These are not cardboard characters. These are very interesting, sympathetic characters, both Richard and Bolingbroke, who usurps the state in effect. And there are serious reasons of state at issue in a play like Richard II. And what it turns on ultimately is perhaps, however, the private interests of parties on both sides. And so it's a very, very complex evocation of the pursuit of sincerely held political values alongside the inescapability of private and personal interests. And again, I think a political topic of interesting relevance for us today. Then I do want to turn to a couple of plays, both of them set in Venice. And again, I think it'll be interesting to talk about why it seemed a good idea to set these plays in Venice, which have to do with identity, in particular racial and ethnic identity, Othello and Merchant of Venice, thinking about the central characters of those two plays in those terms. And finally, a play that concerns gender identity, everything from cross-dressing to rather serious and sometimes class-inflected questions of what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a man, Shakespeare's wonderful forest comedy, As You Like It. And so that would be the subject matter of the second proposed seminar. Thanks very much for bearing with me.